Inside the capsule, the stars were spinning, one revolution every second. Neil Armstrong's gloved hand reached across the instrument panel for a switch he was not supposed to use. Beside him, David Scott was losing his peripheral vision. They were 200 miles above the Pacific Ocean. Houston could not hear them. They had 30 seconds, perhaps 40, before the tumble would take their consciousness, and then it would take their lives. What follows is the story of those 30 seconds. The first true emergency in American spaceflight. A mission so quietly buried that even today most people have never heard of it. 3 years and 4 months before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, he came closer to dying in orbit than any astronaut before him. This is the mission that almost killed him. The mission that earned him Apollo 11. And the mission that by quiet decision, NASA chose not to talk about. Not because of what went wrong, but because of what almost went wrong, and how easily it could have ended another way. It was March of 1966. 2 months earlier, the Soviet Union had suffered a private catastrophe of its own. Sergei Korolev, the chief designer who had put Sputnik into orbit, who had put Yuri Gagarin into space, the man whose name the Soviet public did not even know, was dead. He had died on an operating table in Moscow, at age 59. The Soviet space program would never recover. America did not know it yet. On a launch pad in Cape Kennedy that March morning, 2 American astronauts were about to overtake the Soviets in a single afternoon, and almost die doing it. This is what happened. Neil Armstrong was 35 years old that spring. He had been at NASA for 3.5 years. In Houston, in a small office in Building 4 at the Manned Spacecraft Center, he had a wooden desk and a window that looked out at the parking lot. By March of 1966, 3 of his colleagues from the astronaut office were dead, all in training accidents. The men in the office did not speak of it. His sons Rick and Mark were home in El Lago, Texas. His wife Janet was making lunches and trying not to look at the calendar. 4 years and 47 days had passed since a small white headstone in Wapakoneta, Ohio. He did not speak of that either. He had been chosen to command Gemini 8 by Deke Slayton, the chief of the astronaut office. Slayton said later that he picked Neil because Neil had a quality he could not name. He was, Slayton said, the calmest man under pressure he had ever seen. His co-pilot was Major David Scott of the Air Force, 33 years old, West Point. The 2 men did not have much in common. They would, for the next 3 days, be the most important pair of men in America. The objective of Gemini 8 was to do something no human being had ever done, to find another spacecraft in orbit and dock with it, to join 2 vehicles together at 17,500 miles an hour, in a vacuum, in silence, while moving over the curve of the Earth. The Soviets had not tried it yet. Whoever did it first would change the math of the space race. The morning of March 16, 1966, was clear and cool at Cape Kennedy. A small unmanned rocket, the Atlas Agena, lifted off at 10 o'clock, carrying a 26-foot cylindrical target vehicle into orbit. 101 minutes later, the Gemini 8 capsule sat on a second pad with Neil Armstrong and David Scott strapped inside. The hatch was closed. The capsule was the size of a small car. 2 men, shoulder to shoulder, locked in for what was supposed to be a 3-day mission. At 11:41 in the morning, the Titan booster ignited beneath them. Neil's heart rate at liftoff was reported at 93 beats per minute. For a man being fired into orbit on top of a fueled rocket, this was extraordinarily slow. They reached orbit cleanly. For 6.5 hours, they chased the Agena across the curve of the Earth. Neil flew the Gemini by hand. At 300 feet, the target was a small white cylinder against the black of space. Neil edged the spacecraft forward. 200 feet, 100, 50. The metal docking collar of the Agena filled the small window. 20 feet, 10. He eased the controller forward at 0.3 of a foot per second. There was a small mechanical click. The docking latches engaged. The two spacecraft became one. "Flight, we are docked," Neil reported. His voice was steady. The radio crackled in mission control. For a moment, Houston was silent. Then the room erupted. In a single afternoon, America had done what no other nation had ever done. The first manned docking in the history of spaceflight. 3 days of experiments, a spacewalk, and a triumphant return were now scheduled. The country was ahead in the race, decisively. The Soviets, listening from Moscow, had no answer. Sergei Korolev had been dead for 2 months. That should have been the story. It was not. 27 minutes after docking, David Scott looked at the panel and noticed something. They were rolling. Not fast, maybe 10 degrees per second. The roll was steady. But they were not supposed to be rolling at all. "Neil," he said, "we're in a bank." Neil checked his instruments. The Gemini and the Agena were now joined, a single 32-foot vehicle moving over the South Atlantic. The Agena had been giving them small attitude problems earlier in the day. It was a brand new vehicle, not fully trusted. Mission rules were clear. If the target vehicle malfunctioned, the Gemini was to undock and back away. Neil reached for the undocking switch. It was the right call, given everything they knew. He pressed it. The latches released. The Gemini drifted back from the Agena. The roll did not stop. It accelerated. The two men exchanged a glance. The problem was not the Agena. The problem was them. What they did not yet know was that one of the small thrusters on the Gemini, number 8, on the orbit attitude and maneuvering system, had short-circuited. It had been firing continuously for some time. With the Agena attached, the extra mass had slowed the roll. Without the Agena, the same thrust would now accelerate the Gemini exponentially. Within 60 seconds, the capsule was tumbling at 60 degrees per second, then 90, then 120. They were over the Pacific now, out of range of Houston, out of range of any tracking ship except a small Navy vessel called the Coastal Sentry Quebec, somewhere over Southeast Asia. They were, for all practical purposes, alone. The stars began to whip past the window like sparks. Then they stopped being individual stars and became a single blurred ring. The capsule was rotating at 1 revolution per second. In a small spacecraft, with no head support, this is a brutal thing. Their vision was blurring. Their eyes could no longer focus on the instruments. Loose checklists and papers spun around the cabin. The sunlight came through the windows in a fast strobe. Light, dark, every fraction of a second. Both men were close to losing consciousness. David Scott, in the right seat, said later he had perhaps 15 seconds left. Neil, in the left seat, was experiencing the same. His arms were heavy. His ears were filled with the high tone of the warning alarm. Neil reached forward, slowly, because everything was slow now. He found the OAMS power switch. He shut down the entire main propulsion system, every attitude thruster on the spacecraft. He killed the only tool he had been trained to use to stop the spin. And then he reached for a different switch. The re-entry control system, RCS, was a separate set of small thrusters at the nose of the Gemini, fueled and isolated from the main propulsion. They had one purpose. They were used during the final descent through Earth's atmosphere, when the OAMS was no longer available. To activate them in orbit, hours before re-entry, violated every mission plan he had memorized. But it was the only system left that could stop the roll. "All that we've got left is the re-entry control system," Neil said over the intercom. Beside him, Scott answered with 2 words, "Press on." Neil activated the RCS. The small thrusters fired. The blurred ring of stars slowed. Then it slowed more. The capsule steadied. The strobe became light again. Their vision came back, slowly, the way a photograph develops. In mission control, the audio crackled. Then a voice, Scott's voice, came through. "We have serious problems here. We're tumbling, end over end. We're disengaged from the Agena." It was the first time Houston had heard from them since the trouble began. The capsule was now stable, but the mission was over. Mission rules were absolute. Once RCS was activated, the spacecraft had to come down at the next safe opportunity. The remaining fuel was sacred. It would be needed for re-entry. The 3-day flight was now 10 hours and 41 minutes long. There would be no spacewalk, no further experiments, no triumphant return to Cape Kennedy. Gemini 8 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, 600 miles east of Okinawa. An Air Force C-54 saw the parachute and dropped 3 rescue divers. The destroyer USS Leonard F. Mason arrived 3 hours later, having steamed at full speed. When Neil climbed up the ladder from the recovery boat, the Navy crew applauded. He nodded. He did not smile. He went below decks. According to one sailor, he asked for a glass of water. Then he slept for the better part of a day. The newspapers the next morning were not kind. Some suggested Armstrong had panicked by undocking. Some commentators wondered whether a more experienced pilot might have ridden out the problem without firing the re-entry thrusters. NASA convened a quiet review. Inside the agency, the verdict was unanimous. The thruster failure was a hardware problem, not a pilot problem. Armstrong's decision to undock had been by the book. His decision to activate the RCS had saved both their lives. David Scott, the man who had been beside him in the right seat, was asked later about Neil. Scott said only this: "It was my lucky day to be flying with him." Deke Slayton, the man who picked astronauts, said it differently. Armstrong was cool as ice. 3 years later, when it came time to choose the commander of Apollo 11, the first mission to land men on the moon, Slayton picked Neil Armstrong. Some have said it was because of his test pilot record. Some have said it was the rotation of crews, but many in NASA, including those who were there, said the real reason was simpler. The 30 seconds in March of 1966, the hand on the switch, the capsule that should have torn apart and did not, the choice that no flight rule had prepared him for. 8 weeks before the spin, Sergei Korolev had died on an operating table in Moscow. The Soviet space program, which had led the race for 9 years, was leaderless. Their moon rocket, the N-1, was still on the drawing board. It would, in the years to come, explode 4 times. Korolev's deputies could not hold the program together. The Cold War would end in space, slowly, while the world watched television. But for one afternoon in March of 1966, the man who would carry America to the moon spent 30 seconds, alone, in a capsule that was trying to kill him. And he did not panic, he thought. When he came home to El Lago, Janet asked him how the flight had gone. He thought about it for a moment. Then he went out to play catch with his sons. He rarely spoke about Gemini 8 in detail. When asked, he said only that they had done what they had to do. That was his answer about most of the dangerous things in his life. The thing he had survived in 1962, in a rocking chair in Juniper Hills, he never spoke of at all. The thing he had survived in 1966, 200 miles above the Pacific, he answered in a single sentence. It was the answer of a man who had already learned, before anyone else in his profession, that the only thing to do with a thing that nearly kills you is to walk away from it and keep flying. If you remember reading about Gemini 8 in the newspaper that spring, tell us in the comments where you were when you heard, and subscribe. There are quiet legends still waiting to be told. The moon is the end of this story, but it is nowhere near the beginning.